Stellar. All right. Thank you everyone for tuning in. The first 20 minutes of this, like Mara said, are going to be an information dump of sorts. And then the last 10 minutes are reserved for question and answer and discussion. This is part 2 of a 3-part series. So today we're going to be covering planting seeds and watering them. And then Monday we'll go over the proper lighting for seeds once they've emerged, as well as thinning them. So let's get started. We'll begin with seeding. So when you're seeding, there's kind of 2 avenues to go, right? And really the type of crop that you're seeding is really going to determine what avenue you take in Colorado. The first of the questions to ask yourself is this a warm season or a cold season crop? And so once you determine that, that's going to tell you kind of the best planting methods. If you're using a warm season crop like a tomato or a pepper, I would recommend pulling up a planting calendar. High Mowing Organic Seeds has an excellent one. And you can kind of backtrack from that point, weeks-wise, to tell when you should plant the seed and then when you should transplant that seedling outdoors. In Colorado, it's too short of a growing season to direct seed a tomato or something into the ground and get good yields. When it comes to planting cold season crops, though, the good news is you can direct seed them right now pretty much. If you want to direct seed currently, you're going to want to make sure you have a frost hardy variety. Some really nice frost hardy varieties currently are greens like Mizuna and kale, cabbage, heirloom lettuces like the Lola Rosa, Claytonia, spinach, and arugula. So those can all be seeded outdoors right now and do excellent. One thing though is that I would still recommend covering them to some extent. So, if you're planting those in a raised bed or something, putting a plastic tarp over the top of them or putting some row cover like Agrabon, which is basically a long white cloth, that's going to really give those, seedlings that little extra edge of protection against frost. If you're planting them in a patio pot, which I kind of really like that right now, I would recommend going with a black pot because that's going to retain that heat from that sunlight into the evening a lot better than like a light colored pot would. And the nice thing about patio pots is if you have the space, you can go ahead and pick them up and bring them inside if we're going to have, an 18-degree night like we did last night. For both direct seeding, cold season crops, and then also for transplanting warm season crops, it's pretty simple to seed them. You just follow the packet's advice. And so every seed packet that you get should tell you the ideal temperature for germination. It's all right up here. The ideal temp for germination, how long it takes to sprout on average, whether or not it's frost hardy, the proper depth to be planting that seed at, and then as well as the spacing between those seeds. So you just go ahead and read your seed packet and follow through with that. Right here, I've got a really nice variety of spinach that I like. And that seed depth is 1/4 of an inch. And so this is my seed tray that I've been planting the spinach in. You can kind of see all of these little dimple marks into the soil, right? Yeah, awesome. And so those are all 1/4 of an inch down, and it's a pretty simple method for planting them. All you're gonna do is shake out some of those seeds onto a dry, pretty clean hand. Because if you return those seeds into the packet and your hand's all wet and everything, it's not good storage. Sprinkle them into your hand, drop them into those dimples. You really want the dimples to be in the center of whatever cell shape you're using. So maybe you cut, a milk jug in half and you filled it with potting soil and you put some holes in the bottom. Still try to get that seedling into the center of the milk jug. That's going to give it as much soil around those roots as possible to really flourish. Once you've dropped them into the center, there's this huge misconception with people about how much pressure to put down, after you've planted your seed. So I've got my seeds in there. All I'm gonna do is sprinkle some potting soil onto my hands and just spread it over them really lightly. All right, you can press down just a little bit. Let me raise this up so you can see it. You can press down a little bit if you want to, but really don't apply too much pressure to that soil. The pressure that you're gonna get that seed needs to germinate is gonna come from the watering, which we'll talk about in a second. So don't, go crazy on pressing down or something like that. Big misconception I see. And that goes for planting outdoors as well. You really don't want to be applying pressure from the soil because it still needs to get air in there. There are two kind of annoying, I think they're fun, caveats though to direct seeding anything instead of like buying, you know, seedlings at a store. And that is stratifications and scarification, which I can briefly go over here. So some of the seeds that you purchase are are inevitably going to need to be stratified. We're gonna do like a tiny meditation of sorts. So everyone go ahead and close your eyes. Ready? All right, pretend you are your favorite wildflower or perennial. I'm gonna be a salvia, okay? All right, so it's November. You are a seed that has just shaken loose from the dead plant that grew this past season. And you're sitting there in the ground, and what are you gonna encounter before springtime? You're gonna encounter snow and cold, right? And so you can open your eyes. You need to mimic snow and cold in order to get perennials and wildflowers to grow, and that's the stratification process. A good way for stratifying your seeds, and again, the seed packet will tell you usually if something needs to be stratified, is putting them in a thing of damp sand or of damp vermiculite, and then putting it in the freezer for 10 days to a couple of weeks. And that's gonna mimic that process of that seed being in the snow and being cold, all right? And so certain seeds, you know, are gonna need that. Some common ones would be things like milkweed and lavender, lupine and rudbeckia, which is black-eyed Susans, and butterfly bush. So all of those, they need this process of being cold and damp for a little while. I am the exact opposite. If I were a seed, I would not like being stratified. I want to be hot and in the sun. It'd be something like a straw flower. One thing that is important to remember though, if you're going to be stratifying seeds, damp vermiculite and damp sand, don't douse them in water and put them in the fridge, because that is a wonderful environment for mold to grow in, and fungal diseases are really the enemy of the seedling. So just keep it damp, put it in the fridge, forget about it, put it on your calendar and get it out in a few days. The other, you know, thing that some picky seeds need would be scarification. And scarification is pretty much exactly what it sounds like. It's when you lightly scar or open the seed in order to help it achieve germination. And so that outside of that little seed is something called the testa, and some seeds just have really thick testas. And in order to help that seed open up and get air and water and nutrients into it, we've got to manually do something. Some really easy ways to help seeds open up is to put the seeds in your hand with some gravel and vigorously shake your hands. You can also lightly rub the seed on some sandpaper, or if you're really skilled with a knife, you can just lightly nick off the outer layer of the seed in one spot on the seed, and that'll help open that seed up. So the big seeds that really, you know, need scarification would be things like nasturtium and then beets. They both really benefit from that process of helping thin down that testa. For beets, my favorite method of scarification would be soaking them in water for 12 to 24 hours. That's just going to give them enough time to expand open and help remove some of that testa. Does that make sense to everyone? And if you're like, does my seed need to be scarified or stratified? Look on the seed packet. If it's a flower and you're not seeing it there, I would definitely recommend looking online, because it's going to really achieve the germination rates that you're looking for. All right, a few more pro tips on planting. Some other common mistakes I see. You know, some seeds are so tiny and it's such a pain to plant. I get that. And if you are planting and you drop 2 seeds, or if you're like my sweetheart who doesn't have the most nimble hands and drops 6 seeds into a cell, just keep moving, all right? Don't go back into the cell and try to pick out all those seeds. It's a waste of time. On Monday, we're gonna cover the thinning process, and that's gonna be a lot easier way to get your cells down to 1 seedling per cell. So if you don't have the most gifted hands at seeding, just keep going, all right? Some other things I see would be poor watering. So let's talk about that now. Like I said, that watering is key. Your proper watering methods are going to be what helps you achieve the germination rates you're looking for. So you're not getting that pressure on that seed from that soil, you're getting it from an even covering of water all the way around the seed. And here in arid Colorado, that soil on top is gonna dry out really, really fast. So spraying or watering your seeds once a day in the morning is usually a good method, but you might need to check them again at nighttime and just give them another douse of water. I have some watering can tips that I'd like to share with you now before we go any further into methods, and they're really, really affordable. All right, first tip. If anyone here sprays anything in your house and you have one of these spray bottles, this was previously some rose water that I put on my face at night to feel precious and amazing. So what I did is I filled that with water. And when I'm seeding anything that requires sunlight to germinate, so an example would be the straw flower, just spritz the top of your soil really, really well. You know, the other thing I do with the spray bottle is when I'm first starting to plant something, imagine I just planted that, there's a seed in there, I just covered it up. I give this a good spritzing before I actually hit it with the watering can, because that's gonna help that, that potting medium that you're using stay in it. I'm guessing everyone here who's planted a seed before has, you know, put water on it and then suddenly all of your soil's just flowing over the sides and you're not sure why, and you're not sure if the seed stayed in place, and suddenly you have 6 seeds germinating in one cell and none germinating in the one next to it. You're not alone. It's a watering technique thing though. So giving it that spritz of water right off the bat can really help keep the potting medium down. Some other watering tips I have. Do not use a watering can like this one. This like direct spout that's going on, that's gonna push all of your seeds all over the place. The potting medium is not gonna react well to it. If this is the only type of watering can you have, like me, you're in luck, because there's a cheap alternative. Use a gallon jug of water or a gallon jug from milk and go ahead and stab some holes in the top of it. And then when you turn that upside down, you can control the flow rate by squeezing more air out of the watering can. And you're gonna get a much more dappled watering effect on it, and the potting medium is gonna react a lot better. So I go ahead and use this. Even if, you know, I've direct seeded something outside, say my irrigation isn't on yet because we're still in a really, you know, big risk of frost, go ahead and grab a gallon of something, put some holes in the top, turn it upside down and get to work. Some other watering tips that I have. You know, this is a tragic thing. Really irritates me when I go in a greenhouse and I see that the corners of the cells are dry. It's just the worst. These poor 4 corners are the most neglected part of a seed tray. And so paying extra mind to your corners and really soaking them is gonna really, really help, because I even miss them some days and I go back and I'm like, what was I thinking, you know? So pay attention to the corners and to the edges of your tray. They're the ones that are gonna dry out first, you know? And so you gotta give them a little bit of extra water because they're closer to the airflow. Speaking of airflow, that's another huge mistake I see. And it's something that, you know, is actually a gift rather than a nuisance. How do you say that? Mara and I always laugh about it. Nuisance? For some reason, I don't know how to pronounce half of the words. I just don't speak English that well. So moving on, airflow is a gift. It's not a burden. And even though we're in arid Colorado, you know, you still want to get a lot of air going across those seeds. It's going to help strengthen your seedlings, and it's going to prevent mold growth. This is my favorite tool for at-home seeding. This is like my little microclimate controller. So what I do is I set this on top of the seed trays. It's just a clear plastic dome. And you can control the airflow through the top as well as through both of the sides. And it can help you have to water less, you know? And so if you put that on, it keeps it nice and humid in there, but it also allows the air to go in and out a little bit, which is really, really convenient. And they're super cheap and affordable, and if you use it right, it lasts for a lot of years. That's the only reason why I'll plug a plastic product, is if it actually will last and be beneficial. So the same thing goes for watering outdoors. You know, if you are direct seeding outdoors, you're gonna wanna water them regularly, at least every morning. You're gonna wanna check them again at night. You're gonna wanna use some sort of dispersed watering technique, nothing like direct going onto them. You're gonna want to make sure that there's airflow to your seedlings. A lot of seeds don't need light to germinate, so if you're doing the inside method of seeding things, just go ahead and stack those seed trays on top of each other and then check them in, 4 to 5 days. I didn't even notice that my paper just hit me in the face. So, where was I? Oh yeah, okay. So, what I just said, that emergence thing. And so the time from you planting, germinating, and then emerging is a really, really vulnerable time in the seed's life. So you don't want to be doing this when you're leaving for vacation or even going out that much. Like, you want to be home, making sure that as soon as those seedlings emerge, that you can put them directly underneath light. And I guess this is one of the rogue benefits of the stay at home, is that everyone can pay really good attention to their seedlings right now. But as soon as that little baby seedling, it's usually just like a tiny little nubbin of green, or sometimes we'll even see part of the seed poking out. As soon as you see that, get it underneath a source of light. But in the meantime, most seeds don't need to be underneath a source of light. So let me just make sure we're not missing anything on watering. Okay, we're missing one more thing. Tomatoes and peppers. They're like my favorite thing to start at home, right? But they're pretty picky. And so tomatoes really don't like water on their stems, and peppers don't like dirt on their stems. And so the way that we get around, watering from the top with them is filling the tray underneath whatever your seedlings are in. Fill that with water, set the seedlings in there, and you're gonna get a much better result in your tomato and in your peppers if they can drink the water from the bottom instead of getting it from the top. All right, I just saw some people taking notes, so I took a pause. But are we ready to move into the question and answer? Yep, all right.
Yeah, let's do it. I just want to remind people that if you're going to be asking a question and you would rather not be on the video that we're going to post on YouTube, go ahead and mute your video cameras. You can put your questions in the chat box, or you can just go ahead and unmute yourself and ask questions. We do have, I'd ask a question that Kira was kind enough to answer, but so the dome that you talked about, it sounds like it is called a plant dome, and you can get them at McGuckins and Harlequin, is that correct?
McGuckins, you can get them at Harlequins, you can get them online, wherever you're buying your seed trays from, if you're going like the fancy route of purchasing trays. I've also seen some people, I guess we're going to talk a lot about milk jugs today, but if you cut a milk jug in half and put that on top of them, just creating like any sort of dome structure, even like a wet paper towel on top of those seeds, that's great to help retain moisture while they're germinating. But again, as soon as they emerge, get anything that's going to block sunlight off of them. So get the paper towel off of them, get the milk jug off of them. These are nice because they're super clear and they let all of that light through.
Great. So Theodora asked if you could repeat the part about tomatoes and peppers.
Absolutely. Tomatoes and peppers are like your friends that don't want to be touched. They really like their personal space. They're very finicky. Tomatoes have the potential to root out all over. And so if you're getting water all on them, they don't like that. They're super susceptible to tomato wilt and other fungal diseases. So if you're starting them, I'll lift up this other tray because that one's actually got water in the bottom of it. If you look at my system here, there's a top tray sitting inside another tray. Can you see that? Fill this bottom tray with water and then set these seedlings into it. They'll absorb the water from underneath them instead of from the top. So that way no soil is splashing up onto the leaves, no water is splashing up onto them, and that way they can stay really healthy and happy. So it's called bottom watering.
Okay, we have a question from Rona. She wants to know, if you can say more about the light they should be under?
That's a good question, Rona. And I'm gonna make you wait till Monday. So we're gonna wait until Monday to cover lighting. In the meantime though, getting them under as much light as possible is the way to go. And so we can talk about the artificial options like lighting from heat lamps and from T5s on Monday. And then we'll also talk about south facing windows and putting seedlings outside.
Great, thank you.
And Dakota Ray had a question related to that, which was, if you have grow lights, is there any harm in putting seeds under the lights, even if they don't require light for germination?
No, the only thing that might annoy you, and I actually put mine underneath lights before they've germinated, just because it saves me a step in the process. The only thing is your soil is going to dry out faster on top, and so you most likely have to water them twice a day. And that's just because those heat lights create a lot of heat. They're absorbing all that water off the top, but most likely there's still going to be some water in the bottom of them, so you can give them a light watering at night and a heavy watering in the morning.
So Dita she said she'd like tips for planning what to seed outside now if they have limited garden space.
Great. It's really, right now is the perfect time to be planting greens. So it's like, what greens do you like is the question to ask yourself. If you're a lettuce person, then there are a lot of frost tolerant lettuces out there. If you're a spinach person, spinach loves this time of year. It's actually a lot sweeter and healthier in the cool weather. Certain root vegetables will also do good right now. So that would be stuff like, or do well right now. That would be things like carrots and certain radishes. And then kale is always like a really safe bet for the cold weather. And it tastes a lot better when it's growing out in the cold than when it's growing out in the heat. It's a lot sweeter and less bitter.
And Lauren asked a question, which I know you'll address in more detail on Monday, but she just asked if you can, can seedlings grow okay with the light from a south-facing window, or do you need a grow light?
It's a good question. Certain seedlings and certain south-facing windows work. Certain ones don't. I have south-facing windows in my house and I can't grow seedlings in them because they just get leggy. They're really arching for the sunlight. Leggy is what I'm saying when they grow too tall before they grow their true leaves, and then they kind of fall over under their own weight. So if you really want a strong one, if you have a bay window where there's light coming from the top and the sides, then that's usually an okay south-facing window. But if you're going the route of just like a plain old window, typically you're not going to get the results you'd like.
And then Jane would love a little more detail on if you bottom water, does that mean there's no top watering even with a spray bottle?
Good question, Jane. There's top watering before the seeds emerge. And so from the period of when you've seeded them to when you see the baby plant, you can top water all you want at that point. The seed isn't sensitive to it. It's just once you see that little seedling pop up, that's when I would transition to bottom watering.
And again, that's just for the tomatoes and the peppers?
Tomatoes and peppers specifically are very, very finicky about it, yep. In dry Colorado, we can get away with top watering a lot of things that if you live in an extremely humid place like, say, South Carolina, you might not want to top water things like lettuce because they can be really susceptible to diseases too.
Those are the questions in the chat box for, is that right now? Are there other questions people have? We have about 4 or 5 more minutes. So if there are other questions either related to this, or if for those of you who joined us 2 days ago and you were kind of digesting everything we talked about then and you have follow-up questions, you can chime in on those as well. Or everything. Oh, how much, okay, so Theodora asked how much water?
Great question, Theodora. Water until they're visibly soaked is what I would say in the mornings. And so because, that thing I mentioned earlier about potting medium kind of overflowing and all the perlite floats to the surface and you're not sure if your seeds stayed put, to avoid that, go over them once with that dispersed method of watering, that dappled water is what I call it, and then let that penetrate and soak all the way through, and then hit them with another round of water. You really want them to be soaked. You can't really overwater if you're watering once a day, is what I like to say, and if they're getting some amount of airflow.
Great. And then Jane was curious, and I know we'll talk more about this on Monday, but recommendations for grow lights if she wanted to start looking around.
We'll talk about it Monday, but if you want to start looking around, you have to make the decision, and this is going to be informed by cost, between fluorescent and between full spectrum. If you grow with full spectrum, you're going to get a much nicer seedling, but that's that really bright purple light. The fluorescent ones are usually just a white light, And the other thing to consider is energy use. A lot of them are super high watts. And so that's something to be aware of, that it might kick up your energy bill.
Theodora was curious about if you could repeat what you talked about doing with the paper towel.
Absolutely. So when you've planted and you want that top layer to stay nice and wet, maybe it's drying out into the night because you're using a heat lamp or something, then you can get a wet paper towel and lay them on top. The really important thing is checking underneath it every day to make sure nothing's emerged and germinated and come out of the soil, because if your paper towel's on them when they have emerged, they're going to usually dampen off and die. And so you want to get that paper towel off as fast as possible, but it's a fun, like, cheater way to not have to water again at night.
This is a great question from Karen, and I know we'll talk more about thinning on Monday, but she said, I'm growing cilantro indoors in a 12-inch window box. The seedlings are about 2 inches tall, and it says to thin to 6 inches apart. I'm not brave enough to pluck all but 2 or 3. Should I?
How wide is your window box is my question, because if you're growing in the row spacing and the plant spacing are slightly different. So plant spacing usually pertains to if they're growing in the same row. Now you can kind of do that cheater thing, like if you're baking cookies on a sheet and you want to fit more cookies, you can intersperse them and kind of stagger them. You know what I'm talking about? And so I would do that with cilantro, because in Colorado, unfortunately, you're usually only going to get one or two harvests from your cilantro before it bolts. It's really finicky, really doesn't like the heat here. And so you can really crowd it in there and then get that first yield of them, and then you'll have to replant. So I say plant cilantro every 12 days if you want continual harvests and continual succession plantings of it.
And if she's growing indoors, does all of that hold?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, we have about 1 minute left. Does anyone have a final question about these topics? Wow, you've answered all of their questions.